Welcome to my beginner tutorial series in Learning Android Studio. Android Studio is a tool that you use to develop an Android app, and it's considered an integrated development environment. That's usually abbreviated IDE, and that simply means that it contains a text editor, for example, that uh, is used to write your Java code. It contains debugging tools to help you fix problems when they occur, and it also contains tools for helping to run your app, such as an emulator. In this particular video, I'm going to focus on three things. First, we're going to show how to set up an Android Studio project and get started. Secondly, I'm going to go out of my way to explicitly show you how and where things are organized in Android Studio, where to write your code, where to design how your app is going to look, where your resources go, that kind of thing. And third, I'm going to demonstrate examples of debugging and running your app, because inevitably you're going to run into problems and you're going to need to fix them. So I'm going to show you debugging right in the very first video of this series, and then also how to run your finished app. Prior to starting this series, you should already have some experience with Java. All of my students end up finishing a beginner unit in Java and already have experience using Eclipse, so the transition into Android Studio is a lot easier. So it is helpful if you have some experience with Java before you start this series, but in the next couple of videos, it's not going to be paramount. Secondly, you're going to need Java installed. So if you don't already have Java installed, go to oracle.com, or you can just Google Java JRE, that means Java Runtime Environment, and get Java installed on your computer. You also need the Software Development Kit, that's abbreviated SDK, and that is also available at oracle.com for free. And third, you also need Android Studio installed. So if you need to get any of those, pause this video and continue when you're ready. This is a quick demonstration of the app that we intend on building in this video. In this app, we accept two inputs. The top input is a number, so if I click into the app, we get a pop-up that allows us to put in numbers. So I'll put 10 in the top box. In the second box, I'll put 20. And when I click the Add button, those two numbers are added together, and the result is displayed down here as 30. So just to demonstrate again, I could put in 20 in the top box, and I could put 30 in the second box, and when I click the Add button, 50 is displayed as the result. Let's go ahead and build that app. Now we're ready to demonstrate how to set up your first project in Android Studio. So when you first launch it, you're going to have a screen that looks like this if you don't have any other projects made. And it's simply a wizard that's going to walk you through the setup. So I'm going to go ahead and just click Next on the welcome screen. I'm going to accept the standard setup. And here it wants to download all of these tools. So I'm just going to go ahead and click Finish. Here's where it may end up taking a little bit of time, so I'm going to let this finish and then we'll continue with the video when it's done. Okay, my installation is now done, and that does take a while, so you can now click the blue Finish button in the lower right hand corner. To begin, we're going to click Start a New Android Studio Project, and the first screen is going to ask, what do you want to name your application? So we're going to name this one My First App, and the name doesn't really matter a whole lot right now. Some places where this is going to get used is, for instance, in the action bar, you'll see that displayed, which is at the top of your app. The other place that you're going to see this being used is, for instance, in the package name where your files are going to be created. So let's talk about that next. The company domain name is used for when you actually publish your app so that your files are in a different package from other files. So right now it's not super important, but they're going to begin organizing your code into these folders in reverse domain notation. So we're going to take a web address and flip it around. So a lot of my students ask, what should I put? Because we're students, we don't work for a company. Well, if you're a student, just take your student email and flip it backwards. So as an example, I'm going to put org.mentorschools.butterfield, and that's going to be the folder that is going to contain my Java code. So this is the package name that it's previewing here for my first app. And notice how package names are all lowercase. That's a standard thing. And they take out the spaces in the name as well. Down here is where your project is actually going to be saved on disk. So this is where mine is being saved. We can now just click Next. On the next screen, this is where we're going to select what type of app we're going to create. We're going to create a phone or tablet app. And we get to select the oldest version of Android that can run this particular app. Now, this app is so simple, it's not going to really matter that much. So we're just going to select API 15, which is nicknamed Ice Cream Sandwich. All of Android's API levels have a dessert nickname to them. So like there's Ice Cream Sandwich, there's Jelly Bean, Kit Kat, Lollipop, things like that. Ice Cream Sandwich would be just fine for what we're doing today. Now go ahead and click Next. And for educational purposes, we're going to do a empty activity. An activity is like the screen that you're looking at in Android. So we're going to make a one-screen app for this introductory video, and it's going to be an empty activity. Let's go ahead and hit Next. Now, it wants to create two files for this activity. The first thing is the Java code that will run this activity. So the Java code is going to be called main activity. Notice the uppercase M and the uppercase A. That's a standard class name for Java code. So this is going to be the Java class. It's also going to create an XML file called activity_main. And the XML file will describe what this layout over here looks like. So we're just going to leave these the way they are and click Finish. So the first time that you run Android Studio, it's got to set up all the preferences and everything. So yours is probably going to go a little slower than mine because I've already created an app and it set up all those preferences in advance. So take note down at the bottom, you're going to have this blue bar that shows the progress of creating the app, and then it'll say finished over here when it's actually done. So here it'll say Gradle build finished in 12 seconds. You're also going to get two tabs immediately. The main activity tab, which this is basically the default that is put in here for you. And then you're also going to have a tab for the way that your app looks to start. So this is the activity_main.xml file, and it gives you a little preview of what it looks like over here. But let's talk about the project itself over here so you know how to navigate it. So don't skip this part. This is really important. Over here is how you're going to navigate through all the different parts of your projects as they get more and more complex. So you can see right off the bat, if I were to shrink this down, we're going to be in this folder called Android. We could look at different ways to see our app. We could see all the packages that are in it. We could see the project as it is on disk. We could see what Android cares about. So you're really going to keep it on Android right here because these are all the files that you're going to manipulate, change, and do things with. So have it on Android here, and then you can drill into these folders like manifest, Java, and res, which stands for resources. So let me talk about each one of those right now. So the Java folder is obviously where you're going to put all your Java code. And notice how it created three packages here. The first one of which is consider that your official one. This is where you're going to build your Java files, and you can put them in here. And then there's testing versions underneath. Down here under resources, or res for resources, you've got folders for drawables. That's like your application icon, or pictures that you want to include. You would put that in this folder. The layout folder we're going to work with today. This is the file that if I somehow closed this tab, I could reopen it here. This is where it's actually at. And then you have other files as well. One in particular that's going to be pretty important later on is the values package, and the values store things like your app name. So if I look under the strings XML file, it's holding a reference to the name of our project as app name. So it nicknames that. Anywhere that we put app name in our project and we want to change it to something else like my Edition app, all we have to do is reference this in multiple places and change it once here. That's a much more efficient way to deal with strings throughout your project. So here we create references to strings that we want to have one place to update, and that change is reflected up everywhere else. All right, so this values folder is going to be more important as we move forward. But the two files that we're going to be editing in this video are main activity. So if you somehow accidentally close it in your tabs up here, you can get back to it by clicking this. And your activity underscore main, which is right here. I'm going to go ahead and close the strings file since we're not going to be changing that in this video. A final thing that I'll note is that there is this manifest up here. This is what is loaded in when your project loads into your Android emulator or device that you're going to use to preview your app. And it specifies, I'll go ahead and open up this now, which activity is going to be your starter activity. So you can see here it says that the main activity is a starter activity. So that's the main method, for instance. It's a launcher activity. And you can have multiple entry points into your activity if you wanted. But the manifest is where we're going to specify that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that now that we've had a little tour of your project structure. One other thing that I'd like to do before we start developing is change one preference. And if you go up to Android Studio and you select Preferences, what we're going to add here is like the code prediction for your imports. I find that in years past, students will have something red on the screen and they're wondering, what am I doing wrong? Well, usually it's just an import that you need to bring into your Java file. So to auto import, we can go down here under editor, expand that out, expand out general, and you have this category called auto import. And by default, these two are not checked. So the first thing that you may want to have checked is optimize your imports on the fly. And the second one is add unambiguous imports on the fly. And that means that if it recognizes that something needs to be imported, just do it. And that seems to help out beginner students a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and we'll continue on from that point. All right, so now that we've had a little bit of tour of Android Studio, let's start developing. Let's begin developing the app in the Visual Designer so we can see what we're doing. Now, by default, you may have the blueprint open and the designer view. That's an option with these tabs. I tend to just be in the designer view, but if you lose track of the names of these things, you can flip over to blueprint and spot them pretty easy if you wanted to do it that way. Another thing I'm going to do is if you lose track of these tabs, you can reopen it here in Project. Or if you double click this, it'll shrink down the project and you get some more room in here. You can also zoom in here and zoom out, and that might be helpful for you. All right, so let's start with a blank template. I'm going to select this hello world by clicking it and pushing the delete key on my keyboard, and that's just going to get rid of it. We are in a constraint layout right now, so if you notice in the component tree, we have a constraint layout. That means that when we drag and drop things in here, we can position them based upon what they're tied to. So let me demonstrate that. Let's add two text boxes, which are called edit text. So we're going to go to the palette, and in the text category, we're going to grab an edit text, which is the top choice here. It's called plain text, and drag one of those in. And notice these little green anchors that are around this particular control. And those anchors here are what we are going to use to constrain it to a particular part of the screen. So if I click and drag so that it's basically like glued to the side, it pulls it in that direction. Now if I take the other side and I pull it and attach it to that side, they are now pulling equally left and right, which centers it. And if I wanted to offset it, over in the properties, I could do that by moving this slider to the left or to the right. And here you can see the degree of offset that it has. I'm going to put it back into the center at 50. And I'm going to give a name to this one. Actually, let me tie this one to the top as well. So I'm going to tie that to the top right now. And I'm going to rename this one first num edit text. Now, I like to put the type of control here at the end of the name. And the reason why I like to do that is because when I flip over into the Java code, it's a reminder of what type of object it's going to be. So I'm going to go ahead and push enter on my keyboard, and that accepts that change right there. Now the type of input that I want is not going to be text-based. I want numbers. All right, so I'm going to just check the box for numbers, and that's just going to be the little pop-up box for the user that is the keyboard that they're going to use to put text in there. All right, so now I can close that, and for the hint, that's going to be like the faded text here that tells them what to type. So I'm going to put enter a number, and we're going to ignore the pop-up that's there. And then down here under text, we're going to take out name. So instead we have this hint there that says what to do until they begin doing it. And that's helpful for the user. Okay, now we're going to do basically the same thing with another text box here. So I'm going to go ahead and add another plain text underneath. But I'm going to glue this one to the bottom. So it's relative to that right there. And I'm going to glue it to the right, and I'm going to glue it to the left. Now if you make a mistake, let's say you don't want this glued, notice how when I hover over it in red, I can click it and it goes away. If I wanted all the constraints to go away, I could click this, and that gets rid of them. So let me redo that real quick. All right, now the second one is going to be our second number. So I'm going to call it second num, and it's an edit text. So I'm going to remind myself that it's an edit text object over in the Java code by adding that to the end of it. Now the input type, just like the other one, is going to be a number. And for the hint, I'll say enter a number. And the text will be blank. Now let's add a button to this app. So let's go to the all category in our palette, and the button option is the second one down. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that in. And let's go ahead and anchor it to the bottom of the second control. But what you can do here is you can actually offset the anchor a little bit so it's not right up against it by dragging it. So I'm going to click, hold, and drag. And here you can see I've got a distance of 60 between the second input and this button. To center it horizontally, I'm going to anchor it to both sides as well. I'm also going to change the text of this to add, and lastly the ID, I'm going to make add button, but I'm going to abbreviate button BTN. Okay, so now I'm going to add a text view underneath, and I'm going to drag that into the activity, glue it to the bottom of the button. I'm also going to glue it to the bottom of the activity, which is going to center it vertically between this button and the bottom, and horizontally center it as well. This text view is going to be displaying the result. So I'm going to name the ID of it result text view, and I'm going to make the text appearance. So the appearance of the text is going to be really big. So I'm going to make it, instead of 14 SP by default, I'm going to make it 48 SP, which stands for screen independent pixels. So that's just a size that is compatible with all devices. Now the text of it, let's just put result in here as a placeholder. so you can see how it's going to look. And we can actually push play right now. And if you don't have a device set up, all you have to do is click the Create New Virtual Device button down here. I already have a 5 as an example, so I'll walk through this one. A Nexus 5, select this, click Next, and then if you see download here, you'll have to download it, and then click the Next button. Here's where you can nickname your Android virtual device, which is abbreviated AVD, to be anything you want. You can set up the default orientation to be portrait or landscape and do those kind of things. You can even change the memory that it consumes under advanced and then click finish. I'm going to cancel out of this because that could take a while. So if you don't have one set up, you would want to pause the video here and create one. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and click OK and just see how this looks. It won't do anything at this point, but it will show me if it looks okay. So we'll go ahead and do that. Notice down here is the progress bar of your virtual device. Here it is. Now this could take some time if it's the first time that you've loaded, because it also has to set up preferences just like Android Studio had to do when you first created your Android Studio project. So be patient. And that's the way that we want it to look. So now let's go ahead and develop the code behind. Okay, let's start programming in Java. And to do so, we're going to go to our main activity.java file right here. If you've closed that tab, let me pretend like that's closed, go to your project, open up your Java folder, and open up your first package and click main activity, and that will open it again for you. Okay, we're going to go inside the onCreate method. So the onCreate method goes from this curly brace to that curly brace. So go to the end of the statement that says set content view and add yourself a couple of extra spaces, and we're going to be putting in our code right here. Now what we're going to try to do is we're going to reference the controls that are in this file on the activity_main layout file, and we're going to start with this add button. So this add button, if I select it, we gave it an ID called add button, add btn. To reference it, we need to create an object of a button type. So we are going to create a variable that is a button, and I like to name them the same thing they are in the other file. So to me, consistency helps me remember what it is going to reference. And we're going to assign it the value of something we're going to search for, and that search is going to give back a result. And that result we want to be of the type button. So we're going to cast this result that I'm about to finish here as a button result. So anytime that you want to find something that's in these layout files, you're going to end up using a method called findViewById. So you end up using this method a lot. And if you want to search through your resources for stuff such as your strings or a control by a certain ID, you start with the letter R. R is your resource object. So R dot ID is going to search through your resources for an ID, and when you put another separator, another dot, here's all the IDs that we can find or locate. So the first one that we're trying to find is the add button. So if I start typing A, it's going to pop up here in the IntelliSense that there's an add button. That's what I want. So I'm going to hit tab to autocomplete, and it should fill in with purple. So really all we have to do is add a semicolon to the end to complete the statement. So once again, this full line is creating a variable within the onCreate method that's a type of button, and we're nicknaming it add button. Then we're using this findViewById to search through our resources for an ID called an add button. That's going to give us a result, and we're going to cast it as a button to store it as a reference called add button within this method. So that's what that whole statement's going to do. Now, next up, what we're going to do is we're going to assign an on-click listener. What that means is, as the app is running, I want it to remember that anytime that the button is clicked, do this thing. So to do that, we have to say add button. Now it knows what add button is. It's a reference to that thing called add button on the other file, on the layout file. And I can set an on-click listener. So notice how this is beginning to pop up, and it's case sensitive, set on-click listener. It's this option right here. So when I hit enter, it's going to auto complete that, and we want to create a new on-click listener. Now as I begin to type on-click, it's the first option, and if I auto complete this, it's going to set up the rest of it. So this is going to be creating an on-click event, and all of our code needs to go in between the curly braces for the on-click event. Okay, so in here, we want anytime that that button is clicked to get the two things, the two numbers from this box and this box, calculate the result, and then put it and display it down here. So how do we do that? Well, the first two things are edit texts. All right, so let's call it num1, and num1 is going to refer to, and actually to be consistent, I should call it first num edit text. And that is going to find an edit text by its ID. So we're going to look through those resources for an ID called first num edit text. And here I'm auto-completing by hitting tab a lot. And we need to do the same thing for the second num edit text. So we're doing the exact same thing here. We're searching for the resources for an ID that matches second num edit text. Okay, lastly, we need to put the result in something, so let's go ahead and do that right now. The result is actually a text view, so it's a little different from an edit text. This one is only going to display text, and we named it result text view. So just like the edit text, we're going to take a text view object and find it by its resource ID called result text view. All right, now to calculate the result, all we have to do is get the integer values that are in those text views. So I'm going to call the first one num1, and to convert what is in there, we're going to have to parse it because it's a string, and we want to convert the string into a number. So I'm going to type integer.parseInt, and I'm going to get what is in that input box called first num edit text. I can get the text out of it like this, but then that text has to be converted to a string because that's what the method parseInt wants. Now I want to do that exact same thing, so I'm going to copy and paste this line of code for the second num edit text. So I'm just going to change this to second num edit text, and I'm going to call it num2 instead of num1. Now, for readability's sake, I'm going to create a third variable called result, and that holds the value of num1 plus num2. Now I want to output it. So how do I output it? Well, I am going to request that results text view sets its text to result. Now, result is an integer, so the fastest way to convert it to a string is just to concatenate on a empty string right there like that. So now let's push play and see if it works. So down here, again, you'll have to be patient and let it load. So down here you can see the progress bar. The first time that you try to run it, it's slow. But let's go ahead and enter in a number like 10. And then 20, and then let me shrink this down and click add, and it displays the result. Just to prove that it works again, let's add a number like 50, and 60, and we should get 110 as the result. So if I click add, I get 110. Okay, so everything's working. Next up, let's talk about debugging an app that doesn't work. So now let's talk about debugging. Debugging is the process of fixing your app when it's not working. And you're going to need these skills even if you got it working on the first try. So Android Studio comes with a number of tools that will help you step through your code and see what's going on one instruction at a time. So this is how we do it. Let's pretend like we got this message right here that says my first app has stopped. And that's all the information we have. All right, so what we're going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and click stop, and I'm going to put what's called a breakpoint in my app. I'm going to put a breakpoint inside of the onClick method because the app ran up until the point where I clicked add. When I clicked add, that's when it failed. So there's something wrong in this code here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to run, and I'm going to select the debug option. Now it's going to come up with, okay, what would you like to run? Well, we're just going to run our app. But if there were multiple entry points into our app, we might want to run main activity directly or whatnot. But in this case, it's such a small program, we can just run the app. All right, so now this is going to come up in the emulator. It should give us a message that's saying that it's turning on the debugger portion, so be patient. And now we only put a breakpoint in here to pause the program after we click that button right there. So let's put in some information here. I'm going to put a 2 and a 3, and then I'm going to click add. Let me go ahead and shrink that down too. So I'm going to click add, and now my program is paused at the instruction that is the first thing in the onClick method. All right, so down here is going to be your console. It's going to show you the values that your variables are holding. And we can basically move this program forward one instruction at a time. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to the Run menu, and your options for moving forward within the program are Step Over, Step Into, and Step Out. Those are going to be the three ones that you use the most. Step Over means I don't need to drill into this line and, for instance, go into the Find View by ID method. I just want to step to the next line. In other words, execute that line and move on. I also would suggest that you just memorize that Step Over is F8, Step Into is F7, Step Out is Shift F8. That's going to be really helpful for fast debugging. Okay, so Step Over will just go to the next line. Step Into will go into any methods that are taking place. And Step Out will return you from a method that you're in into the method that called it. All right, so those are the ones you're going to use. So I'm going to do Step Over first, which just moves it forward one line. Now down here, you can see over here the result that it found an object. If it says null here, that's a problem. It means it never found the control that you're looking for. It also is going to print these out down here as we go. So I'm going to go forward a couple of lines. So I'm going to hold down the function key on my keyboard and push F8 and get a couple more results. Okay, so up to this point here, I'm looking in this view right here. I found some objects. I found the first num, I found the second num, I found the result. Num1 parsed to 2, num2 parsed to 3, and the result of adding num1 and num2 was 5. So now this is where I planted the error that we're supposed to find. Result rate, the setText method is supposed to take a string object, and I gave it an integer on purpose. So as I move forward now on this next line, so if I were to step over, this is where it's going to say I've got a whole bunch of errors. So this should trigger in your mind that there is an error on that particular line because it's now jumping into other stuff. we got a null value, things of that nature. So all of these lines executed okay except for this last one. The problem that I planted in here was that we had to concatenate result with an empty string to turn it into a string, because that's what the setText method is requiring as input. So now that it runs, we should be able to push play again. Let me go ahead and restart the app now that we've discovered what the error is. Click OK. And by the way, those breakpoints, you can have as many as you need. So you could build those up if you wanted to pause and continue. All right, so to test this app, let me put in something like 7 and 8. Shrink that down, click add, and we get 15. So now the app is running again. And that's how you step through code one line at a time and see what happens. If a particular line causes the app to crash, you know that's where the error is at, and you can address it. Before you move on to the next video in the series, let me review some important points in this video. For instance, the first thing that we demonstrated was setting up an Android Studio project. There's some details of that should be pretty important for coming projects, like for instance, where your project is actually being saved and what API level did you select. The second thing that I demonstrated was the typical places that you're going to be moving around in Android Studio. For instance, where your main activity got saved and the layout file for that main activity. You're going to be going back and forth into those folders quite a bit. So navigating through Android Studio is something that you should be comfortable with, at least in those areas that we did in this video for future videos. And lastly, I also demonstrated some debugging tips and how to run your app in Android Studio. I cannot stress this more, that debugging is such an important skill that you need to start learning how to do that from the very first Android app that you develop. So if you need to, go back and review those parts of the video that went over those important points, and then go on to the next video in this series.